Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm not doing a phone commercial. Thank you very much for sticking around and joining us. We've saved the terrific for last. We were going to present an award to Tom Seaver in theory, and then Art Shamsky showed up earlier. When a 1969 Met comes into your life, you hand the award to him and say thank you very much. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Greg Prince. I am one of the writers of the blog Faith and Fear in Flushing, the blog for Mets fans who like to read. So if you have read it, I thank you. If you haven't, faithandfearinflushing.com. Also the author of several Met books, the most recent of them, Amazing Again, about the 2015 Mets. I only bring that up because I have copies with me if anybody wants to buy one. A book about Mike Piazza coming out in March. If you're interested, I can tell you about that later. But the high-minded matter at hand is Tom Seaver, and we are approaching a milestone for number 41. And it's one of those anniversaries I'm having a tough time getting used to, even after about 5 years, because since 2012, when the Mets and I each turned 50, we have things that happened to us 50 years ago, and it's a strange thing to happen to both a person and a team, but it's been happening to the Mets every year since 2012. And one of those 50th anniversaries is coming up. On April 13th, 1967, the best of things happened to the Mets. Wes Westrom, the manager between Casey Stengel and Gil Hodges, give or take a Salty Parker, handed the ball to rookie right-hander to start the second game of the season at Shea. It was the rookie's major league debut. And I think it's fair to say the team and the sport haven't been the same since. Tom Seaver faced the Pittsburgh Pirates that Thursday afternoon. The Mets won. A precedent was established. And Seaver and winning went together like no Met and no such result ever had before. Tom was about to become one of the best pitchers baseball has ever known, and hands down the greatest Met we have ever known. There was nobody remotely like him prior to April 13th of '67, and there's been nobody quite like him since then. It's been 50 years and he's rarely been matched by any pitcher from any team, and he hasn't been touched by any Met at any position. I think it's fair to say he's had quite the half century, and as a result, so have we as Mets fans. Tom's primacy as the Met of Mets is so established and so obvious that after 50 years, we might not fully comprehend the texture of what he achieved on the mound for us from 1967 forward, or his apparently immovable place atop Met history. Our mission today, then, is to explore the accomplishments and legacy of Tom Seaver as we celebrate 50 years of Tom being our indisputable best player. To help me out on this mission, I'm thrilled to be joined by two terrific writers. To talk about the early part of Tom's career, we have Bill Reisick, author of The Amazing Mets, 1962 to 1969, an absolutely essential volume for anybody who cares about Mets history. And I think Bill has some copies with him. I also want to endorse another of Bill's books that isn't Met specific, but overlaps with our interest in its way, Crash of the Titans, about the Jets' early years in the Polo Grounds. Fantastic writing and incredible history. Talking about the latter portion of Tom's time as a Met, including the sore subject of how he got away, will be my friend Matt Silverman, author of a veritable baseball library of Met titles, most recently One Year Dynasty about the '86 Mets, and he's covered the '69 World Championships, editor of The Miracle Was Landed, the You Gotta Believe pennant 4 years later in Swing in '73. It's the best 50th anniversary book I know of, The New York Mets, The Complete Illustrated History, and a whole bunch of others. And I thank Matt for not yet getting to 2015 and leaving Amazing Again to me, so thanks again. We could frame Tom Seaver's grandeur by quoting statistics, and I'll be happy to note a few a little later, and maybe some of you guys will too. But to get us started in our commemoration of 50 years of number 41, I want to take us to any given year in the early to mid-1970s, and either remind you if you were around, or let you know if you weren't, what life was like for a Mets fan coming of age in the age of Seaver. In January, you leaf through the sports section and your face lights up because there's a picture of Tom Seaver, maybe posing in the snow at Shea Stadium, maybe indoors, and he's signing his contract for the upcoming season. Spring training can't be far off. In February and March, you go to your local candy store or newsstand, and you start to look for preseason magazines, and somewhere on their covers, you find Tom Seaver. You grab those, and either at that place or maybe at a bookstore, you find the paperback guides to the season ahead. If Seaver's picture isn't on those covers, his name figures prominently in the text as soon as you turn to the Mets preview, and you grab those too. By March, baseball cards are out, and of course you're buying as many packs as you can reasonably handle. You rip them open in hopes of finding a Tom Seaver. If you're fortunate, your year of collecting is made. If you're not, there's a very good chance you'll find some kind of insert with Tom's picture, or a leader card with Tom's face, because he's always leading the league in something. You might get Tom Seaver in action, or Tom Seaver's boyhood photo, or something referring to how Tom Seaver helped the Mets to the playoffs in the World Series the year before. Those are pretty good cards too. Come April, opening day is upon us, and you don't need to check the probable pitchers, because you know who's starting the season for the Mets. Tom Seaver has been the opening day starter every year since he established himself, and no Met manager is going to mess with that tradition. It works. The Mets almost always win on opening day. As the season gets going, you take special pride in scouring the statistics in the Sunday papers. You don't have to scour far, because Seaver, NY, is inevitably at the top, whether you're looking at wins or innings pitched or winning percentage or earned run average or strikeouts. If you're going to a game, you hope he's pitching, but even if he's not, you can't miss him. He's on the cover of the yearbook, he's on the cover of the scorecard. He's Tom Seaver, he's everywhere. July comes along, and it's all-star selection time, and your question about who will be representing the Mets goes simply, Tom Seaver and who else? Tom is the personification of an all-star, whether he's starting the game, coming on in relief, or just tipping his cap among his peers. Coincidentally or not, the National League is always winning these games. The season wears on. Seaver keeps pitching. Usually he wins. Sometimes he pitches more than well enough to win, but the Mets don't score for him. But every start you can anticipate greatness. Maybe he'll throw a complete game. Maybe he'll throw a shutout. Dare we dream of a no-hitter? Probably he'll be on Kinder's Corner, where he and Ralph have a second-nature rapport, legend to budding legend. You'll hear Tom talk seriously about his pitching, and you'll hear Tom cackle giddily about his hitting. By September, if the Mets are in the race, you'll look forward to those nights or afternoons when Tom starts. You'll figure you'll pick up ground on the Pirates or put more distance in front of the Cubs. If the Mets aren't in the race, there's still plenty to get excited about. Tom is nearing 20 wins, or Tom is extending another strikeout record, or Tom is lowering his ERA out of reach of any other pitcher. Whether at the beginning or end of the season, Tom Seaver always keeps you in the game. Tom is still pitching beyond earliest October. You know it's been a great year to be a Mets fan. And you can keep watching him on TV doing what he does best. Tom is done. You look forward to November and reading about the Cy Young voting. Tom probably deserves to win another award. If he wins it, you'll be happy. If he doesn't, you'll be sure he should have. If nothing else, you'll have another reason to have Tom Seaver on your mind, which is the next best thing to having Tom Seaver on the mound, which will happen again soon enough, because by January, there'll be a picture of Tom at Shea, signing another contract, ready to begin another year, and once more, spring training can't be far off. This is what it was like to grow up and mark time with Tom Seaver. It was hard to fathom it hadn't always been this way, and that it wouldn't always be this way. But there was a time before Tom and a moment when Tom definitively burst onto the scene. To hear about what those days were like, let's hear from Bill Reisick.
Well, thank you, Greg. I usually like to start these things by making a connection with the audience. So let me begin by saying that I've been a Yankee fan for over 50 years. But grew up as that rarest of birds, a dual Yankee and Met fan as a kid. And some of you may have known Dana Brand, the late Dana Brand, who wrote a great book called Mets Fan. And Dana once told me he gave me a lifetime pass for being a Yankee fan for writing the amazing Mets. So the toughest thing about talking to a group like this is trying to tell you something about Mets history that you don't already know. But we'll see what I can do. Now, magicians are known for pulling rabbits out of hats, but the Mets pulled a Hall of Fame pitcher out of a hat in 1966, which is probably even more remarkable. As most of you know, Seaver became a Met when his contract with the Braves was voided, and Commissioner Eckert invited any team to match the Braves' offer, and if it did match, you'd have a drawing and pick one of them. Now, here's a Mets trivia question. We've got a couple of Mets trivia experts here. Whose hat was it? Matt?
You got me on that one.
It was Joe Reichler's hat. Joe was Commissioner Eckert's assistant. I thought it was pretty appropriate they pulled the name out of a hat, because you had the impression they may have pulled Eckert's name out of a hat to make him commissioner. Not sure how he became the commissioner. But the Phillies, the Indians, and the Braves were interested, and the Mets name came out of the hat. And after a year in Jacksonville, Seaver was in New York. Now, the common wisdom is he joined the Mets when they were at the bottom. The Mets were terrible, they were awful, and all of a sudden Seaver brought them up. But at the time, 1966 was considered a great year for the Mets. If you followed the Mets that year, which I did pretty closely, it was a wonderful year. Wes Westrum was a hero. It's hard to believe that a 66 and 95 team was considered to be fantastic, but they were setting all kinds of records. If you read through the papers that summer, they won 13 more games than they'd ever won before. They didn't lose 100 games for the first time. They didn't finish last for the first time. They're mostly avoiding negatives, but they were great things. They won a season series for the first time. They had a winning road trip for the first time. They had a winning month. All these records all season long. So 1966 was really a happy time for Mets fans. But the downside of it is they were doing it with a lot of older players like Ken Boyer, Bob Shaw, Bob Friend, Chuck Hiller, Ed Brusue, people like that, who were not going to be around if the Mets were going to be in a World Series, because it was not going to happen the next year or the year after that. And by the time they got good, if they did get good, those players, Ken Boyer was going to be gone. The Mets, if they were going to have long-term prospects, needed some youngsters. And of course, one of those youngsters was Tom Seaver. He was 12-12 at Jacksonville, which is not that impressive. His earned run average was a little over 3. But people were talking about him that year as if he were something special. Solly Hemus was the manager, his manager at Jacksonville. And a quote from Hemus, he said, "He's the best pitching prospect in the minor leagues. He has a 21-year-old arm and a 35-year-old head." He said Seaver reminded him of Robin Roberts. And there were a number of people I interviewed who had played with Seaver in the minors, and of course they had the advantage of hindsight. They knew how he turned out. So there's some of these maybe exaggerated a little, so I tried to separate the fact from the opinion. Someone said, oh, I could see then he was a Hall of Famer. That's pretty hard to believe. But Larry Miller was a player who didn't pitch too long for the Mets. He was a very bright guy. He's an MBA, a management consultant, very good interview, long interview with him. He played with him at Jacksonville, and he said, he was brilliant. I took batting practice against him, and he hit the low outside corner 6 times in a row. This was during batting practice. He was very focused, very intense. I think he had a good idea that if he stayed healthy, he was a Hall of Famer. And so many comments were the same, that intensity. I mean, batting practice, most players are getting their arm loose or just throwing the ball in there. Seaver was working the corners. He was working on his stuff. He was thinking about what he was doing. And that was what came through to everybody. So he came to St. Petersburg in the spring of 1967 with a big build-up, excellent prospects. But Jacksonville is the International League. What's he going to do against major league hitters? There are a lot of highly touted prospects that never make it. See a lot of players who either came out of college with big reputations, looked good in the minor leagues, and then just didn't make it. Everybody watched him that spring. There are a lot of Met veterans. Bob Shaw, who was a real student of pitching, again, another great interview, and a very interesting man. He said, the one thing that worried me is he dropped his elbow. He didn't get his elbow up on top, and therefore anyone who does that cannot throw a really good curveball. So that kind of worried me. And he said Robin Roberts also did not do that. As it turned out, Shaw said that was not a problem. He had a slider. He didn't have a big curveball. And Shaw said he had maturity. He had concentration. Everybody mentioned 2 things about him. One was his maturity, and 2 was his delivery. And Matt was kind enough to give us a visual aid up here. You see his delivery, how low he got to the ground, and how much he used his legs in his delivery. After he'd had a couple of good years with the Mets, they decided they were going to have all their pitchers do that same delivery, where they got very low to the ground. In spring training of maybe 70, 71, they had about half the staff had groin pulls because it was not a natural motion to them. That was a natural motion for Tom Seaver. And the maturity also wasn't natural for a lot of them. When Tug McGraw came up to the Mets, he was 20 going on about 16. And Miller told me that he was just out of control. He said, here he was a college graduate in his mid-20s. And McGraw's coming, we're roommates, McGraw's coming into the room. 3 o'clock in the morning with all his buddies waking me up. And finally I told him, get out of here. I'm trying to make the team. I'm trying to make it in the major leagues. I got to get my sleep. Grow up. And he was diving off the pool and getting drunk, diving off the diving board into hotel pools and doing all kinds of stuff. And Seaver, on the other hand, was about 22 going on 40. Jack Fisher said if he hadn't been a major league pitcher, he would have been the chairman of General Motors. And that was back when General Motors was considered the epitome of top management. Now he'd probably say he would have been chairman of Apple or something like that. And that's one thing I've always thought about when interviewing all these players, who makes it, who doesn't. I like to ask people, why do you think so-and-so made it? Here's somebody who was great talented and didn't. And someone said earlier on one of the panels, maybe it was Tim Toffel, said Dwight Gooden was one of the greatest pitchers in the history of the major leagues. In my opinion, Dwight Gooden was one of the most talented pitchers in the history of the major leagues. He was not one of the greatest pitchers, and so much of his lack, in fact, he wasn't one of the greatest pitchers, was his personality and his personal habits, not his ability. It makes such a difference. Sometimes they don't get out of the minor leagues because they're homesick, they're lonely, they can't deal with the responsibility. You're like talking McGraw times 2, and that has a lot to do with him. And Seaver had that tremendous maturity, and he had the ability to work under pressure. Chuck Estrada was another veteran who was with the Mets that spring. And he said he was standing in the outfield with the other veterans watching Seaver throw batting practice. And he said we'd stand around and say, I wonder what his makeup is like. We knew we could throw. We knew we had good stuff. And his comment was, he said, you wonder, what will they do when they cross the white lines? And then he laughed, and he said, we found out. The other players looked up to Seaver, and he was younger than a lot of them, but they all looked up to him. Jim McAndrew, another pitcher from that time, said, Tom was almost a guy like a suit and tie. We were intimidated by him. But they liked him. And he said, I think somebody asked Art Shamsky about Seaver earlier, playing behind him. McAndrew said, I think players played better behind him than behind anybody else. They just had that confidence. He brought everybody up to a higher level. They made the plays. They knew they were going to get the ball in play. So in spring training that year, there were 2 phenoms, Tom Seaver and Bill Dennehy. He's a 21-year-old right-hander. And if you go back and look at what was written at the time, they thought they were about equal. Now, Dennehy happened to grow up in the same town that I did. And you ran into him years later. He had written his autobiography, and he had someone ghostwrite it. I won't tell you who, but it was awful. So he said, would you like to work with me? I think I called him up for this book. And he said, well, tell you what, I've got my memoirs drafted. Would you like to work with me on it? So I took a look at it, and I talked to my publisher and said, what do you think about writing a biography of Bill Dennehy? He said, Bill Dennehy's not, we don't care about Bill Dennehy. Last year, Peter Golenbach wrote Dennehy's autobiography with him, which I always remind my publisher of. Peter Golenbach's obviously a much bigger name than me. So they fought it out in spring training, and it was kind of equal. They both looked very good. Both made the starting rotation, and you remember how many games they won? Seaver won over 300 games. You know how many Bill Dennehy won? 1. He won 1 game, had arm trouble, had drug and alcohol problems, and that's one of the reasons his autobiography had some play. He had a lot of problems with drugs and alcohol later on, and quite an interesting life. But they both made the starting rotation on April 20th, and a second major league start, Seaver beat the Cubs for his first major league win, number 1. And what made that win a little bit unusual is that in the 8th inning, they were leading 2-1, and Wes Westrom came out to the mound and said, how do you feel? Now, what's your typical 22-year-old starter going to say? I feel great. I'm going to go get him, even if his arm's about to fall off, because you don't tell a manager you can't come out. What Seaver said was, I've had it. I'm done. And they brought in Don Shaw. And that was astonishing for someone that young to say, yeah, I've had it. You better take me out, because I'm not going to finish here. It's unusual. He won a second game on April 25th. It was a 10-inning game, and later on, they interviewed him in 1969. He said he thought that was a turning point for the team. And a quote, he said, I felt that for the first time, we realized we could achieve something. It was the first time in my experience with the Mets that we believed in each other. The first time I felt I wasn't here to lose. And that was the big change that Seaver brought to the team, the fact that they were there to win, not to lose, because the Mets had that comic persona. They went 66 and 95, and everybody thought it was the greatest thing ever. Well, Tom Seaver wasn't going to be happy with 66 wins, or 67 or 68, thinking, hey, we made 8th place this year. It was a difference in attitude, and he brought that to the team. And by the end of June that year, Seaver was on a pace to set several Met records. which were not that impressive at that time. At the end of June, he had 6 wins, and he was on the pace to break the all-time record for wins. And he was also ERA, strikeouts. He was the first Met pitcher ever named to the All-Star team, which he saved by pitching the 15th inning. And that was the first time Tom had pitched a game under pressure, and America saw what he could do in a pressure game. And it was quite a bit. And as the season wound down, the records began to fall. On August 13th, he won his 12th game, breaking the record for wins by a right-hander, held by 3 other players. Here's a trivia question. 3 other players.
Jack Fisher.
Jack Fisher, that's 1. No, close. No, close. Dennis Ryban and Bob Shaw. He won his 12th game. You were ahead with your answer here. On August 27th, he beat Roger Craig's record for complete games. On September 31st or 13th, he won his 14th game that set a Met record, beating Al Jackson's record from 1963. And he also beat Jackson's strikeout record with his 146 strikeouts. So you can see that these Met records were not exactly Cy Young type, but they were Met records. At the end of the season, he held the Met record for ERA. He had a 2.70 ERA, which broke Carl Willie's mark. He even stole 2 bases, which was a Met record for Met pitchers. And what I was wondering about that. Just last night, I was checking that out. I said, hey, he stole 2 bases. I wonder if that was a record. I went back, and it was a record. And what I found out was, before 1967, no Met pitcher had ever stolen a base. It was the first stolen base ever by a Met pitcher. And Seaver was such an inspiration on the base pass that year that Danny Frisello stole one also. But Tom Seaver wasn't there to steal bases. That was not why he was with the Mets. He was there to win games on the mound. His final record that year was 16-13. He had 18 complete games, 170 strikeouts, and he was named National League Rookie of the Year. And there were some other pretty good National League pitchers that year. Rookie pitchers: Dick Hughes of the Cardinals was 16-6. Don Wilson of the Astros, who had a nice career. So All-Star, Rookie of the Year, best pitcher in Mets history. That was Tom Seaver's 1967 season, his first as a Met. That was pretty good, but it was only the beginning. There were many, many more great seasons to come. I'll pass the microphone.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. Well, the beauty of Tom Seaver was twofold. There was watching him, his aesthetically perfect drop and drive motion, the power pitcher who led with his legs, got his right knee dirty, blended rising fastball, curves and sliders consistently for strikes, and that was what you could see. Could only imagine or wait for his post-game remarks to get a handle on what he was thinking. As ideal as he was physically, he was just as beautiful when it came to the mental game. Then there were the numbers, number 41 put up. The basics of his career are easy enough to quote. 311 wins, 3,640 strikeouts, an ERA of 2.86 over 20 seasons, 3 Cy Youngs, 12 All-Star selections, 16 opening day starts, 5 one-hitters, 1 no-hitter, albeit in the wrong uniform, and a 10-inning complete game World Series victory that put the Mets on the brink of a world championship. Though they didn't show up in the box score, there also seemed to be a new book about or by Tom Seaver every year, and I use by in quotes, including one I remember using for a book report in 6th grade. And I made the last paragraph nothing but a year-by-year recitation of his statistics to date. And even at the age of 12, I knew that was a bit much, so I don't want to drown us in numbers. Still, those numbers never fail to floor. So here are a few numerical notes to consider when you consider Tom Seaver. In the first 10 years of his career, 1967 through 1976, when he was becoming and had become Tom Seaver for us, Tom compiled 182 wins, 2,334 strikeouts, and a 2.47 earned run average. You know who else in the major leagues could match that profile? Nobody. Nobody else did anything like that during the first 10 years of Tom Seaver's career. So he wasn't just bias that convinced Mets fans he was the best pitcher in baseball for a decade. He really was. Those are the traditional markers of what made a pitcher outstanding when Tom was coming up. WAR, or wins above replacement, did not enter our lexicon for several decades. But when it did, we found, according to Baseball Reference, that Tom Seaver was worth 71.2 wins above replacement for those 10 years, 67 through 76. And you know what pitcher did better in baseball? None. Nobody else has a better WAR for that decade. Gaylord Perry finished about 5 wins above replacement behind him, and Fergie Jenkins more than 10, and they're the runners-up. You go on Baseball Reference, go to the page with National League pitching leaders for 1973, as all of us like to do. Having 73, a good Met year to be sure. And check out who led the league in 17 different statistical categories, traditional and advanced. Wins, though, weren't even among them, a symptom of the Mets not being the most offensively robust of clubs throughout Seaver's stay. For the record, Tom had only 19, finishing behind Ron Bryant of the Giants, and won the Cy Young anyway. One truly troubling season in Seaver's first decade was 1974, when he was bothered by sciatica and finished a horrifying, for him, 11-11, ERA skyrocketing to 3.20. And yet, when you click the Baseball Reference page forward from 73 to 74, you still see Seaver's name dotting the leaderboards in the top 10 across all kinds of interior categories and placing him 4th in pitcher WAR. We didn't know it at the time, but even when Seaver was at his worst, he was among the best. And as an aside, when Seaver was nearly at his best, we weren't easily satisfied. I clearly remember a comment from Bill Mazer, longtime sportscaster in New York, you may remember from Channel 5 or even WFAN. This was in 1972 when he was hosting the Met postgame show on WHN. And he said very definitively, and remember, Bill Mazer, was a very authoritative voice. He wasn't, just a gas bag. And he said, sure, Tom Seaver has won 20 games, but it hasn't really been a Tom Seaver year. And that's how high a standard he set for himself and for all of us. One more quick statistical glance, and this is from 1983, which point Tom, a Met for the first time since, if you'll excuse the expression, June 15th, 1977, was 38 and pitching for a last-place team. The one-loss record wasn't much, 9-14, and the ERA, 3.55, indicated he was clearly on the back end of his fabulous career. Even with age and wear and not a very good Met squad behind him, Tom comes in 10th in the NL in innings pitched, 9th in games started, and 7th in fewest hits allowed per 9 innings. And by the way, he also led the National League in triples with 2 at the end of April. But that's, like you said about stolen base, that's not what he was there for. So if he's not one of the best pitchers in the league by his 17th season, he's definitely one of the better ones. And as we'd find out over the next 3 years, he still had plenty left in the tank. But the tank would be found elsewhere in 1984, just as it was transferred to Points West in 1977. Tanks for nothing, we'd find ourselves saying twice to 2 sets of Mets management. So for the tankless assignment of guiding us to life without and ultimately after Seaver, turn to Matthew Silverman.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Bill. Before that, just before I have something on the day he was traded. That I became a Mets fan in 1975, which was his last great Mets year. And so that was sort of what I had to go on. And a couple of years, and then it seemed like after he was traded, every time I went to a game, either Pat Zachary pitched or Pete Falcone, who was actually worse. But made up for it forever by skipping school to go to his return game in 1983, which is still one of the great thrills of being a Mets fan. But I was owed something after waking up at 12 years old on June 15th, 1977, a Wednesday. Began with the Mets in Atlanta. The Mets wound up winning that night, but Tom Seaver wasn't there. He left in the first inning for New York. His number 41 jersey in his locker. Seaver had last worn it in a game 3 days earlier in Houston. When his turn came up in the rotation again, number 40 was on the hill. Pat Zachary. What happened in between was both a long time in coming and should never have happened. The 1977 team had 7 players who had been all-stars during their Mets careers, and none of them were happy. John Madelack and Dave Kingman openly groused about the team's parsimonious ways, especially in light of the Mets coming up empty during the first winter of free agency. The others watched as the team's poor start led to Joe Torre going from backup infielder to rookie manager. Seaver, on the other hand, was working on a contract extension to remain a Met. A discussed deal with owner Linda DeRoulet, who'd taken over ownership for the team following the 1975 death of her mother, Joan Payson, called for an extension of 3 years, worth a total of $1 million, that would have kept Seaver at Shea through 1981. Negotiations went on even as he feuded with the Mets board chairman, M. Donald Grant, who tended to treat players like ungrateful serfs who should take what they were offered and say thank you. He was ill-equipped to deal with modern athletes. Seaver, a well-spoken, smart leader who'd commanded respect even as a rookie on a 100-loss club, was not Grant's kind. Further, Seaver was the team's player representative, and Grant believed that the pitcher was behind Kingman's spring training holdout. Seaver and Grant squabbled almost daily in the papers. Seaver went directly to the owner for his contract, giving Grant more to resent. Grant's mouthpiece, Daily News columnist Dick Young, had been a trailblazer in his field, but now firmly sided with Grant. Young's son-in-law, Thornton Geary, was in the team's communications department at the columnist's request. Thank you. Young compared Seaver to Walter O'Malley, the Dodgers owner, still despised in New York for moving the club. Both are very good at what they do, Young said in comparison. Both are very deceptive in what they say. Both are very greedy. Jack Lang, who'd been hired by the Daily News just a few months earlier after the Long Island Press folded, covered Seaver from his side. Lang had eaten breakfast with the pitcher and was with him when he heard about Young's column in that morning's Daily News. When he sat with reporters and television men at poolside later, Seaver learned of a Dick Young Daily News column alleging that Nancy Seaver was jealous of Ruth Ryan because Nolan Ryan had signed a much bigger contract with the California Angels. Seaver pondered the allegations, then suddenly bolted from his chair. He strode briskly to his hotel room and called Arthur Richmond, the club's public relations director. "Get me out of here," he yelled to Richmond over the phone. "Get me out of here." Seaver was traded to the Reds for a package of Steve Henderson, Doug Flynn, Dan Norman, and Zachary. Mets fans were devastated. Another Grant-inspired deal sent Kingman to the San Diego Padres for Bobby Valentine and Paul Siebert. Trading Joel Youngblood to St. Louis for Mike Phillips actually worked out pretty well, but the three deals at the deadline were forever dubbed the Midnight Massacre. The next day wasn't any better. Seaver had stayed in Manhattan and appeared on the network television show the next morning. He cleaned out his locker at Shea and then met the media. He spoke matter-of-factly about the situation, having repeated the details several times by now. But when he asked about the New York fans, Seaver's calm demeanor crumbled. He left for nearly 10 minutes before he regained his composure. Then, when he started talking about the fans again, he could not go on. Lang was there. Jack Lang wrote, "Seaver's voice broke off and he began to sob. He tried to continue but could not. His head bowed again. He asked for a reporter's notebook and scribbled a few words. He asked the reporter to read it and sat quietly and listened to what he had written. And the ovation I got the other night after passing Sandy Koufax for the career strikeout on this career strikeout list, that will be one of my most memorable and warmest moments of my life." The red-eyed Seaver went to his locker and collected his belongings. In a moment, he was gone.
Hey, thank you.
Sorry for the downer, but you know.
Yeah. Well, he came, as we know, he came back, and then, of course, they let him go again. But, you know, he did come home eventually. Tom Seaver pitched his last official inning in 1986 as a Boston Red Sox. Curtailed to come back with the Mets in 87. Had his number retired in 1988 and entered the Hall of Fame in 1992. He hasn't added to his Met total since any of those milestones. Yet he maintains his place as the greatest Met ever, unchallenged 50 years after he basically invented the concept of great Mets. Have you ever seen a greatest Met list that wasn't topped by Tom Seaver? Have you ever tried to make one? It's not so much that it would be sacrilege, it would be inaccurate. Dwight Gooden's 1985 might have surpassed any of Seaver's individual seasons as the crown jewel of pitching years, but Doc couldn't keep up that kind of accelerated pace for long. Mike Piazza, the second player to go into the Hall as a Met, gave us indelible memories, connected on critical swings, and was primarily responsible for perhaps the most dramatic era of Mets baseball, but he established the first half of his legend elsewhere. David Wright is all Met all the time, and he already owns almost every Met offensive record there is. But the captain, ever the good soldier, would be the first to tell you that as terrific as we think he is, his cumulative impact on the franchise hasn't come close to that of the franchise. Darryl Strawberry hit more home runs than any Met. Dave Kingman hit them longer than any Met. Yoenis Cespedes is as breathtaking as any Met. Buddy Harrelson was about as reliable as they came. Nobody was more dynamic on the base paths than young Jose Reyes, unless it was Mookie Wilson. If anybody swung sweeter than Rusty Staub, it was John Olerud. Gary Carter pushed the Mets close to a championship after Keith Hernandez steered the ship around. Carlos Beltran did almost everything right. So did Edgardo Alfonso. Ray Ordonez did one thing well, but he might have done it better than anybody, Met or otherwise. Ed Kranepool for 18 seasons is a chapter unto himself. Jerry Koosman still hasn't lost a postseason start for the Mets, and he made a bunch. You gotta believe in Tug McGraw, and Jesse Orosco, and John Franco even, when it comes to closing games. We cross our fingers that someday we'll be at a discussion like this and praising to the high heavens the likes of Syndergaard and Harvey and Matz and DeGrom and all they did and how long they did it for. We have no shortage of great Mets. Well, we have only one Tom Seaver, the greatest of Mets. Started being great 50 years ago this April. He has yet to stop. Thank you. Anybody want to chime in with any thoughts, questions, memories?
So,
You want to take the microphone?
1973, that was basically the year that I started following the Mets. Obviously, after I started really in 1970 after they won, because I was still a kid, and they asked which team should I be a fan of, and they said the Mets, you dummy, they just won. I'm like, oh, okay. But 1973, it's still bothering me. What do you guys think if they rested Seaver and started Stone? What would have happened?
Well, Matt wrote a book about 1973. I'm going to defer to him first.
It is a good question.
What would Tom say?
What would Tom say? Tom, would say, "Give me the ball, I'll do it." But one of the things, and I looked at it from many different angles. I talked to Howie Rose. We talked about it for a long time because he was actually at the game, and he started the first conversation about this idea on the walkway from the top of Frigid Shea Stadium after Game 5 of the World Series, which if the Mets had gotten 3 runs together in Game 3, where he was unbelievable, I have a tape of that game, they wouldn't have had to go to Oakland because the series would have been over. He pitched unbelievably well, and the Mets couldn't score off him. But one of the reasons they didn't win that night, and one of the reasons I don't know that anybody would have won that Game 6 is because Catfish Hunter pitched. And as money a pitcher as Tom Seaver was, there's rarely been any pitcher, and if he hadn't pitched for the Yankees, he would be absolutely forgotten today. But Catfish Hunter was a money pitcher, needed to pitch a great game that day, and did, and the A's won. If George Stone had pitched and he'd lost, we'd be going, what would have happened if they had started Seaver in Game 6? So, they would have won or they would have lost. Who knows? It's like Schrodinger's cat, or Schrodinger's Met, or however you want to look at it.
Bill, come here. No. I would just add one thing. The manager in '73 was Yogi Berra, and Yogi really believed in leaning on his starters more so than Gil did. I think Gil would have made him, and again, we don't know. Gil might not have led the Mets to a division title in '73. There's no telling. I do remember that the talk being in the air as a 10-year-old, and I remember thinking, George Stone was pretty good this year. Why isn't he pitching? But what's done is done, and it's pretty good they got to a Game 7, I keep telling myself.
Anyway,
Yes, sir.
oh, in the late 60s, the Mets, the starting staff of Koosman, Seaver, Nolan Ryan, Gary Gentry, those guys were under the tutelage of Rube Walker, and it was unusual then that they had a 5-man rotation. And I've just wondered, I've always thought how that impacted the longevity of especially Seaver, Koosman, and Ryan, and whether any of those guys ever mentioned or talked about Rube Walker and his effect on them.
Yeah, I think it did. They were one of the first to go to the 5-man rotation, and in my opinion, what really led to their longevity was the way they threw. And if you look at so many of the pitchers that lasted for a long time, Ryan, that leg action, Seaver, the same thing. And if you look at pitchers who didn't last a long time, there's a lot of arm. I mean, there are exceptions to every rule, but I mean, to me, Don Gullett was the guy. You see Gullett, he landed flat-footed, threw the ball, and Gullett was done in his 20s. I think it wasn't so much the rotation as the mechanics they taught them and some of the mechanics they came with that led them to their longevity.
And to answer the previous question, if Nolan Ryan had been there, you wouldn't have had to worry about George Stone. But yeah, I do think that had something to do with it. Although one of the things that bothered Ryan is that they were always moving the rotation around a little bit to accommodate Seaver, because Seaver wanted to pitch on the 4 days when they could. They did have a lot of pitchers, but it was Ryan always seemed to be getting bumped, and he and Gil Hodges sort of bumped heads about that as much as you could, with her. And he was in the reserves, but when someone was getting bumped, it was always Nolan Ryan. He had the blister problem, and so there was reasons that he was getting. But once they started pitching him every 4 days in Anaheim, he was setting all kinds of records, and it was an amazing pitcher. But if you ask me, and I think I'm in the right crowd, I'll still say Tom Seaver was better.
Yeah, Greg, something just when you've been having this conversation and hearing a couple things that are like something just popped into my head. But Gil Hodges and Rube Walker, and something I interviewed Rod Keneal. What he said to me, he said, I told Dick Young after the 1969 World Series, I said, the reason the Mets won this year is because of Gil Hodges. And the reason the Mets will not win in 1970 and maybe after that is because of Gil Hodges. And he said that Hodges was able to get something out of these players. These players had never won before. Hodges got them to commit, and he drove them, and they were willing to make the sacrifices because they had never won before. They were young. He said, but now they won, they're different. They're champions. They feel differently. Hodges will not be able to get them to make the same commitment. He'll have to change as a manager, and he won't, because that's the way he is. He will still try to drive them, and they won't respond in the same way they had before. And I thought that was one of the most interesting comments. I know a lot of you guys don't remember the 62 Mets, but Rod Keneal was one of those guys who was a character. And I interviewed him. I expected kind of a happy-go-lucky, joke-telling guy. He was one of the most interesting people I interviewed, very introspective on a number of things. And I think on Hodges, that was a very, very interesting point that he made.
Just two quick thoughts. Tom did go out of his way to thank Rube Walker when he went to the Hall of Fame. I thought that was telling. And the five-man rotation, I think, was very important. There was one moment in time, 1970, they tried to get more starts out of Seaver. He was off to a great start, 17-6. Started going on 3 days rest. There was even talk of him going for 30 wins. It had only been 2 years since Denny McLain had done that, and it didn't work. Tom went into this first real slump, finished up 18-12. So I think the five-man rotation, which became the industry standard, was a godsend. Anybody else? Okay.
Anybody go to his preeminent victory?
Yeah.
That day?
Yeah.
No, I was going to say, I don't know what happened to my ticket stub. It's really bothering me that I lost it, but that was a great day because I remember the week before when I was watching the scoreboard at Shea Stadium because he was pitching for the White Sox and I saw he was winning. The next morning, I went out and bought 10 tickets to that game. It was a great day.
Yeah, I was there by accident, and I said I was a Yankee fan, and the reason we were there is because, as you remember, it was also Phil Rizzuto Day. My wife's Italian; she loved Phil Rizzuto, so we had to go to Phil Rizzuto Day and see him get knocked down by the Holy Cow. So we were just there, and my friend and I were going. We said, "Oh, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One, he could be going for his 300th. Turned out he was. The thing I remember most about that game is we were down near right field. And there were so many Mets fans there because of Seaver. And there were, of course, so many Yankee fans there because the Yankees were playing. By the time the game ended, almost the entire right field stands was cleared out because the fights were unbelievable. There were people in front of us, people with chains and leather drinking. 'Cause my wife she was very pregnant at the time. and there was someone in front of her, and she kept saying, my wife saying, "Sit down, I can't see." And her boyfriend was about 3 times my size with chains hanging off him and all kinds of things. I said, "I don't care if you can't see, just sit down, be quiet." "Well, I can't see." They were asleep by the 3rd inning, but the whole right field stands was cleared. And they just kept running. They had that move in the Yankee Stadium at that time they were really good at. They picked somebody up over the head, out with them. You just kept carting them off the fighters one at a time.
Thank you. I wasn't at the 300th win, but not too many people probably could say I was at his 299th win at Fenway Park, which was also by chance. A friend of mine and I had never been to another ballpark outside of New York. Like, let's drive up to Boston. Let's go when they play the White Sox. Maybe we'll see Tom Seaver. And La Russa left him in, I think it was, 9 innings. It was tied. They took the lead. The White Sox took the lead in the top of the 10th. And we knew, and I can't remember the closer's name at the moment, but we said, hey, this is going to happen in New York, which I wasn't at. But on the same day, Tom Seaver's record of 10 wins in a row in a single season for the Mets broken by Dwight Gooden, who was having the season of his life. So a great day to switch back between channels 9 and 11, New York and Chicago, because the Mets were playing the Cubs and they were just either catching or passing the Cardinals for first place.
I wasn't there for that, but I was just thinking about at the end of last year, 2015, and the Mets have already clinched, and Max Scherzer is pitching, and he's got a no-hitter going. And I hate the Mets getting no-hit. I still remember on Seaver's team, he didn't pitch that day, but they got no-hit by Ed Halicki in 1975, and I was pissed off for about a year about it. And the same with the one that they had in the Astrodome, which was the last one for a long time. But Max Scherzer struck out 9 guys in a row, and Curtis Granderson is up, and they've still got the no-hitter going. And I'm like, the thing I'm not even worried about the no-hitter. I'm worried about him tying Tom Seaver's record of 10 straight Mets. And so Granderson hits the ball, and it's clear from the moment that he hits it, it's a pop-up. I'm like, yes! And I got no hit, but at least Seaver's record was still there.
Okay, time for one more question, Michael.
Yeah, a question for anybody on the panel. It was interesting, you're talking about Seaver's maturity coming up to the Mets in '67, almost like he was a fully formed individual. But was there anybody in baseball or elsewhere who helped influence him, who shaped him, who really helped create the guy the athlete, the performer that Seaver was?
And I really don't have a good answer. I don't know of any one particular person who did. I think he and Hodges got along, but Art Shamsky said it was something that's interesting today. He said, I didn't really have a personal relationship with Gil Hodges, and I don't think most players did. I think he was, in those days, the manager was at another level, didn't really relate to them, but I think Seaver, more than anybody else, had a pretty good relationship with Hodges.
I know he was very, very fond of Hodges. I mean, he held him in great reverence, Hodges, and he really felt that Hodges played, it was just incredibly important to the team.
Yeah, Tom has credited his father. He's talked about his time in the Marines. He talked about Hodges a great deal. My impression is, like you said, he kind of came out of the womb fully formed and ready to take the ball.
And go 9 innings.
And go 9 innings.
If I may, just something I noticed and then left it behind. But I was coming up with the numbers. I did something in this book about Seaver's numbers that will last forever, and I wanted to see how far he was ahead in each one, and he's miles ahead in every Mets category. But in wins, which people say nowadays, well, that's not really that big of a deal, it's a team thing, all this and that, but when Tom Seaver pitched, he earned every one of those 198 wins, because there was even the ones that they scored 10 runs for him, he had plenty where they scored 1 run for him, and he ended up losing and or didn't get their decision. And his lead is 198 wins. Dwight Gooden has 157, and if you do the math quickly, that's number 41.
And you can't go wrong with number 41 to end it. So I want to thank Bill. I want to thank Matt. I want to thank all of you for coming. We'll be sticking around for a couple of minutes. We each have some books if you're interested, and just to say hi. So thank you again.